A man of faith standing before his congregation, preaching about redemption, about righteousness. Yet, beneath the holy robe, he carried a terrifying secret. One so horrific, it would shock the nation and cement his place in history, not as a man of God but as a monster hiding in plain sight. This is not just a case of betrayal. This is something far worse. A tale of deception, obsession, and unspeakable horror. A story of a man who led prayers in the morning and committed atrocities at night. A man who spoke of salvation while secretly planning destruction. His crimes were so cruel, so horrifying, that he became the only priest in American history to face the ultimate punishment of death. But what drives a person to commit such atrocities? Was it his upbringing? His dark desires? Or was he simply a man who believed he was above consequences? In this tale, we unravel a case that defies comprehension. A case that exposes the dark underbelly of power, faith, and madness. A case that left investigators questioning everything they thought they knew. What really happened behind closed doors? How did a man entrusted with guiding souls lead himself down the path of evil? And how did his crimes finally come to light? Buckle up, because this is the horrifying story of Father Edward Langley, a priest with secrets too dark to remain hidden. A horrifying discovery, body parts scattered along the riverbank. Investigators are struggling to identify the remains. A gruesome act committed not by a nameless drifter or an escaped convict, but by a man of faith. A man who stood before his congregation, offering words of salvation, all while hiding a grotesque secret. How does a priest, someone devoted to guiding lost souls, become a murderer? And not just a murderer, but one capable of an act so unthinkable, so disturbing, that it shook the very foundation of those who once trusted him? The church has always been a place of refuge. A place where people seek comfort, forgiveness, and salvation. But what happens when the one meant to offer redemption is the one who needs it most? When the voice delivering sermons about righteousness is the same voice whispering unspeakable sins in the darkness? This is not just a story of murder. It is a story of deception, of hidden desires, of a man who wore the mask of holiness but harbored a mind filled with unrelenting darkness. A man who led prayers by day, and by night, indulged in acts so horrifying that history would never forget his name. To the world, Father Edward Langley was a man of faith, a devoted servant of God. He stood at the altar, his hands raised in prayer, his voice calm and reassuring. His congregation saw him as a spiritual guide, a man who could lead them closer to salvation. He baptized their children, blessed their marriages, and offered words of comfort during their darkest moments. But what they didn't know, what they could have never imagined, was that the man they trusted with their souls was capable of the unthinkable. There were whispers, unspoken doubts, a lingering unease that some couldn't quite explain. His sermons were passionate, but his presence, unsettling. His kindness, rehearsed. And those closest to him, they would later admit that something always felt off. But they never could have guessed the truth. They never could have known the kind of secrets that festered beneath his holy robes. To understand the horrors that would come later, we have to go back. Back to where it all began. Before the church, before the murders, before the world knew his name. The story of Father Edward Langley didn't start in a place of peace, but in a home filled with violence. A house where fear was a language spoken daily. Where love was twisted into something cruel. Where a child learned, long before he could understand it, that pain and power went hand in hand. Edward Langley was born in a small town in Pennsylvania in 1893. A town where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, where Sunday mornings meant church, and Sunday nights meant families gathered around the dinner table. But behind the walls of the Langley home, there was no warmth, no safety. Only fear. His father, Thomas Langley, was a man feared by many. A man with a short temper and heavy hands. A man who ruled his household not with love, but with fists. He was known for his violent outbursts, for the way his wife would flinch when he so much as raised his voice. And Edward, he was no exception. The boy learned early that kindness was a weakness, that pain was power, that silence was survival. The abuse was relentless. Some nights, neighbors heard screaming. Other nights they heard nothing at all, and that was somehow worse. But no one ever stepped in. No one ever knocked on the door to ask if the boy was okay. And so, Edward learned to endure, to accept, to adapt. By the time he was 7, the signs were already there. Small things at first. The way he watched people, not with curiosity but with something else. The way he spoke about God, not with devotion but with something that made others uncomfortable. And then, the animals. It started with insects, then mice, then rabbits. He never cried, never hesitated. And when his mother found him in the backyard one evening, blood smeared across his hands, he only looked up at her and smiled. Edward's fascination with religion started young. But it wasn't the kind of faith his mother hoped for. While other children learned about kindness and redemption, he was drawn to something else. Something darker. He spoke of sacrifice, of blood, of suffering. And when the family cat went missing, his mother never asked questions. She already knew the answer. As he grew older, his desires only deepened. His curiosity evolved. By his teenage years, he had become known for something else, something that sent whispers through the town. His secret relationships. With men. With women. It didn't matter. What mattered was control. What mattered was dominance. And though he stood in church every Sunday reciting prayers, making the sign of the cross, his thoughts were anything but holy. The world saw a boy who would one day become a priest. But those who truly knew him? They saw something else entirely. They saw a boy who had already decided who he would become. A boy who had already taken his first steps down a path he would never turn back from. It was a day of ceremony. A moment meant to mark a lifelong commitment to faith, service, and righteousness. The congregation sat in silent reverence, their eyes fixed on the young man kneeling before the altar. Father Edward Langley was about to take his final vows, sealing his place within the church. December 8, 1907. A towering cathedral. Hundreds gathered. Bishop Thomas Albrecht presided over the ordination, reciting the sacred rites as Langley bowed his head in submission. His hands trembled, though not from fear. Not from humility. From something else entirely. His path to priesthood had been anything but smooth. Rumors had followed him, whispers of strange behavior, of a mind that seemed detached. But the church saw no reason to deny him. His eccentricities were overlooked. His devotion was praised. He spoke of visions, of divine encounters. He claimed that his true ordination had not come from the hands of a bishop, but from something far greater. "I was praying at my bedside when she appeared to me," Langley once confided. "A vision of Saint Margaret. She stood before me, her hands outstretched. 'I ordain you to the priesthood,' she said. There was a light around her, warm, blinding. I told no one. I thought it best to keep it to myself. They would make fun of me. They always make fun of me for these things. They expect others to think as they do. But God speaks in different ways. Only some are chosen to hear him." But Langley's devotion was not what it seemed. Those who knew him well had doubts. There had always been something off. Something that unsettled those around him. The first red flags appeared almost immediately. His sermons carried an intensity that made some uncomfortable. His presence in the church at times felt less like a shepherd guiding his flock, and more like a man desperate for control. Then there were the private moments. The confessional whispers. The late-night meetings with altar boys. The relationships that should have never been. Parishioners spoke in hushed tones, uneasy about his influence over their children. But the complaints never made it far. When murmurs of misconduct surfaced, the church responded as it always had, with quiet reassignment. No formal action. No punishment. Just a quiet transfer, another congregation unaware of the past. For years, Father Edward Langley continued his work. Leading Massachusetts offering sacraments. Speaking of salvation, all while hiding a secret so dark, it would shake the foundation of everything the church stood for. But nothing remains hidden forever. And soon, the truth would begin to slip through the cracks. Over time, Father Edward Langley had kept his desires hidden. The whispers, the accusations, the sudden reassignments, none of it had been enough to stop him. He had learned how to be careful, how to manipulate, how to twist faith into something that served him. But in the winter of 1912, something changed. She arrived at the church as a stranger. A woman alone, with no family, no history, nothing tying her to this place except the promise of work. Her name was Katerina Varga, a Hungarian immigrant who had come seeking a new life. She was young, soft-spoken, and devout, everything Langley had convinced himself he needed. She came to clean the floors, polish the pews, and tend to the candles that burned day and night for the lost souls in need of prayer. But to Langley she was something more. Something he could possess. At first he was patient. He watched from a distance. He learned her habits. When she prayed, when she left the church, when she lingered in the empty chapel, staring at the stained glass windows as if searching for something. Then he began to speak to her. At first it was about faith. About God's will. About sacrifice and devotion. She listened, nodding politely, never suspecting that every word was carefully chosen, every conversation leading her deeper into his grasp. He told her that she was special, that she had been chosen, that God had sent her to him. What began as stolen conversations soon became something more. Late-night meetings in the rectory. Hands grazing just a moment too long. Whispers in the confession booth that had nothing to do with sin. She was hesitant at first, but he reassured her. It is God's will, he told her. He brought us together. Who are we to question his plan? And so she believed him. When the affair began, it was hidden beneath the weight of secrecy. Letters passed in the dead of night. Meetings behind locked doors. But what Langley saw as a divine right, Katerina saw as love. She believed him when he said they would be together. She believed him when he told her she was different from the others. But belief was a dangerous thing. And when Langley saw that she was no longer afraid, when he realized that she no longer looked at him with reverence but with expectation, he knew something had to change. One night, he brought her into the small candlelit chamber behind the altar. In his hands he held a document. A marriage license signed, sealed, proof that in the eyes of God they were husband and wife. She wept when she saw it. Overcome with emotion, she fell into his arms, whispering words of love, of devotion. She had no reason to doubt him. No reason to suspect that the paper was a forgery, that the ceremony had never truly happened. For Langley it was never about love. It was about control. But then the pregnancy changed everything. She came to him one evening, her hands shaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I am with child. For the first time in his life, Father Langley felt fear. A priest with a wife was scandalous. But a priest with a child? It was the kind of revelation that could ruin him. And ruin was not something he would allow. At first he tried to reason with her. Told her they would leave, start anew. That it was all part of God's plan. But the more he spoke, the more frantic he became. The more he tried to justify the lies, the closer he edged toward something darker. Days passed, then weeks. The congregation noticed his sermons had changed. He spoke of sacrifice, blood, and of the things that must be given up in order to remain pure in the eyes of the Lord. And then the voices began. He heard them in the quiet hours of the night. They whispered to him from the shadows of his chambers. They called to him from the altar. At first he ignored them. But they grew louder. She is the devil's temptation, they told him. She is corrupting you. She must be given back to God. Langley began to believe them. Katerina saw the change in him. She saw the way his hands trembled, the way his eyes darted to unseen figures in the corners of the room. She heard him mumbling to himself, prayers mixed with something else, something unrecognizable. She laughed when he first spoke of sacrifice. She thought he was joking. She didn't laugh when she woke one night to find him standing over her, watching, his lips moving in silent prayer. The next morning she tried to leave. Langley stopped her at the church doors, his grip tightening around her wrist. You cannot go, he said. You were sent to me, you belong to me. For the first time she was afraid. She locked herself in her small room in the back of the church, clutching the growing life inside her, whispering prayers of her own. She planned to run. To disappear before it was too late. But Langley was always watching. And he would not let her go. No one heard the struggle. No one heard the muffled screams. By morning, there was nothing left but a room scrubbed clean and a man preparing to stand before his congregation, his hands folded in prayer, his voice steady as he delivered the word of God. But the night before, within these same walls, something unholy had taken place. Katerina had been restless that evening. She had not eaten much, her body weakened from the weight of carrying the child. The tension in the church had grown unbearable. Langley's presence had changed. He was erratic and unpredictable. Some nights, he stood at the altar for hours, whispering prayers that no one else could hear. Other nights, he would disappear into the crypt, emerging only at dawn with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. She had tried to leave once before. She had waited for the right moment, stepping quietly through the halls, past the empty pews towards the door. But when she reached it, she found it locked. The key was missing. Langley had known. That night, she lay in bed, her breath slow, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. The oil lamp beside her flickered, casting soft golden light against the walls. She tried to push away the fear, telling herself that it was only exhaustion, only the weight of her condition. She did not hear the footsteps in the hall. She did not see the figure standing in the doorway watching and waiting. The blade was in his hand. The decision had already been made. Langley moved with the precision of a man who believed he was fulfilling a duty. His steps were careful and measured. He approached the bedside, his face expressionless. The voices had spoken to him again that evening. She must be given back to God, they had said. The child must not be born. He had argued and had pleaded for another way. But the voices were insistent. If he did not act, his soul would be lost. He would be cast out and condemned. So he obeyed. As the candlelight wavered, as Katerina drifted in and out of sleep, the blade pressed against her throat. A single swift motion. Her eyes shot open, a sharp gasp escaping her lips, but only for a moment. Blood poured from the wound, staining the sheets, spilling onto the wooden floor. She clutched at her neck, her fingers trembling, her body convulsing. Langley watched. For the first time there was no sound. No cries for help. No pleas for mercy. Only the gurgling, the slow fading of life, the warmth of her blood spreading across his hands. He had expected guilt. Expected regret. Instead he felt something else. A rush of power. A certainty that he had done what was necessary. The voices had been right. She was an offering. And an offering was not complete without the final act. Langley had read about such things before. Ancient texts. Forbidden doctrines. The purification of the soul through blood. He had always dismissed them as superstition, until now. The warmth of her body remained, the lifeblood still fresh. He knelt beside the bed, dipping his fingers into the crimson pool, tracing the shape of the cross across his forehead. Then he did something unimaginable. He pressed his lips to the wound. At first he hesitated. But then something deeper took over. He drank, slowly, methodically, as if partaking in the holy sacrament. The coppery taste filled his mouth, thick and warm. This was not death. This was transcendence. By the time he lifted his head, Katerina's body was still. Her eyes, once so full of fear, now empty. But Langley was not finished. He removed his robe, climbed onto the bed, and committed an act so vile, so unspeakable, that even the shadows in the room seemed to recoil. By the time it was over, his hands were shaking. But it was not fear. Not remorse. It was exhilarating. He had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back now. By the time the church bell struck midnight, Langley had already begun his next task. The body could not remain. It had to be destroyed and erased. He moved with a calculated precision, slicing through flesh, separating limb from limb. He wrapped each piece carefully in cloth, ensuring that there would be no traces left behind. The night was cold when he stepped outside, the air thick with fog. The ferry dock near the river was empty at this hour. He carried the bundles with ease, placing them in a wooden crate. A priest traveling with a chest of belongings raised no suspicion. As the ferry cut through the water, Langley stood at the edge, staring into the blackness below. One by one he let the pieces slip into the depths. The water swallowed them without a sound, the ripples vanishing as quickly as they had come. By the time he returned to the church, the first signs of dawn had begun to creep over the horizon. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and violet, as if the world itself remained unaware of what had taken place. Langley stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He washed the blood from his hands, changed into his vestments, and when the bells rang, calling the faithful to morning mass, he stood before them as he always had, his voice calm, steady and unwavering. Let us pray. No one noticed the faint scent of iron in the air. No one questioned the tired look in his eyes. And no one, not even for a moment, suspected that beneath the altar they knelt before, something was missing. Someone is gone, as if she had never existed at all. It began with a single discovery, an object tangled in the reeds along the riverbank. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than discarded cloth, caught by the current and left behind as the waters receded. But as the morning light crept across the shore, revealing the damp fabric's faded patterns, something became clear. This was not just cloth. This was not just debris. The fisherman had been awake long before sunrise. He had stood at the river's edge, casting his net, waiting. The waters were higher than usual, the current strong from the recent storms. He had seen driftwood float past, branches stripped of their bark, tangled masses of weeds and debris. But then he saw something different. A bundle, wrapped tightly in cloth, caught against a rock. The material was heavy, soaked through. The current tugged at it, but it did not break free. Curious, the fisherman waded in, pulling it closer. The cloth was soft beneath his fingers. Then as he turned it over, the fabric shifted. And something slipped out. Something pale. Something unmistakably human. The authorities were called immediately. Officers arrived, the riverbank soon lined with men in uniform, boots sinking into the mud as they worked in silence. The bundle was carefully lifted, placed onto a stretcher. The cloth, once soft and patterned with delicate flowers, was now stained, darkened by something deeper than river water. But it was not just one bundle. Within hours, another was found further downstream. Then another. Each wrapped the same way. Each holding something terrible. For the investigators, the first question was simple. Who was she? There were no missing persons reports. No complaints filed. No one had come forward searching for a lost sister or a missing wife. The river had given up its secrets, but the name of the woman remained unknown. It was the fabric that held the first clue. The pillowcases, soft, floral, well-made, were traced to a local furniture store on the outskirts of the city. The tags, still intact, led detectives to a recent shipment. And among the records, a single receipt stood out. A purchase made just weeks before. Paid in cash. No name but an address. And the name listed on the order? Benjamin Whitmore. When the officers arrived at the address, the door was locked. The building itself was unremarkable, an old apartment complex, its hallways dimly lit, its tenants keeping to themselves. They knocked. No answer. The landlord was hesitant, reluctant to involve himself in his tenants' affairs. But when shown the documents, the receipts, the detective's badge, he hesitated only a moment before unlocking the door. The apartment was small and neat. Almost too neat. A single bed against the wall, a wooden desk covered in papers, an armor with only a handful of clothing inside. It was a place of function, not comfort. And then, something else. Near the corner, a rug was pulled slightly askew. When lifted, the stain beneath it was unmistakable. Dried blood. It had seeped into the floorboards, the pattern irregular, as if something, or someone, had been dragged. But it was the desk that held the most damning evidence. A stack of letters. Each written in delicate, slanted handwriting. Each addressed to the same man. Langley. The letters were read in a soft, echoing voice, overlapping, building in intensity. I don't feel safe here anymore. Something is wrong with you. You promised we would leave together. Why are you changing your mind? I'm scared. I think I might be pregnant. It was enough. The blood. The letters. The false name. It was time to find him. Langley was at the church when they arrived. He was exactly where they expected him to be, standing at the altar, hands folded, eyes closed in prayer. He did not look up when the officers entered. Did not move when they approached. Even as they surrounded him, he remained still. Only when the handcuffs clicked into place did he speak. His voice was quiet, almost calm. I killed her because I loved her. He did not resist. He did not fight. As they led him away, he did not look back. The congregation stood frozen in place, watching in stunned silence as their priest, the man who had guided their prayers, who had baptized their children, who had spoken of God's love, was taken from them. No one spoke. No one moved. And somewhere beyond the walls of the church, the river continued its steady, endless flow, carrying away the last of the evidence, but never the truth. A man of faith. A man of power. A man accused of something unspeakable. The trial of Father Langley was unlike anything the country had seen before. A priest standing before the court, not to bless, not to lead in prayer, but to answer for what had been found in the river, for the letters soaked in blood, for the woman who had once trusted him, loved him, and had paid for that love with her life. And yet, as he sat in the courtroom, dressed in his clerical collar, hands folded neatly in his lap, there was no sign of fear. No regret. No guilt. Only patience. As if this too was simply part of God's plan. From the very beginning, the defense knew their strategy. They painted a picture of a troubled man, haunted by visions, plagued by unseen forces that had driven him to commit the crime. Experts were called to the stand. Psychologists. Clergy members who had once worked alongside him. They spoke of his unusual behavior, his long nights of fasting, his whispered conversations with no one in particular. The defense attorney stood before the jury, his voice heavy with meaning. This is not the work of a sane man, he declared. This is the work of a man who believed he was acting under divine command. A man who was lost in his own mind, his own faith turned against him like a blade. The courtroom was silent. Then came the prosecution. Their argument was different. Cold and methodical. This was no accident. No moment of madness. This was planned. They presented the letters, the hidden marriage, the forged documents. They showed receipts, maps, sketches found in Langley's apartment, drawings of the river, of the ferry routes, of the places where the water ran deep. He knew exactly what he was doing, the prosecutor told the jury. He prepared for this. He executed it with precision. And he did it in the name of a God who never spoke to him at all. The jury listened. For days they debated. They could not agree. Some saw him as a monster. Others saw him as a broken man. And when they returned, their decision was clear. Hung jury. No conviction. For some, it was a failure of justice. For others, it was a sign that perhaps the priest had been telling the truth all along. But the prosecution was not finished. And neither was the law. When Langley returned to court, the focus had shifted. This was no longer just about the murder. This was about money. Because hidden within the priest's careful records, among the religious texts and handwritten sermons, investigators found something unexpected. A life insurance policy. Signed and dated. And taken out just weeks before the murder. Langley had named himself as the sole beneficiary. The woman he claimed to love had been worth exactly $5,000 to him. The jury listened as the documents were read aloud. They heard the evidence. The betrayal. The cold calculation. They deliberated for only 3 hours. And when they returned, the verdict was final. Guilty. Even in the face of his own execution, Langley remained calm. He did not beg for mercy. He did not cry. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply nodded, folded his hands and spoke. I beg forgiveness of all I have offended or scandalized, and I forgive those who have wronged me. There was no explanation. No apology. Just those words, spoken with the same quiet authority he had once used from the pulpit. And then, with the stroke of a pen, his fate was sealed. The only priest in American history to be sentenced to execution. The night before, he did not sleep. He spent the hours in prayer, kneeling beside his cot, whispering words only he could hear. At dawn, the guards entered his cell. He stood without resistance. Walked without hesitation. As he was led to the execution chamber, he did not look at the witnesses behind the glass. He did not meet the eyes of the priest who had come to offer him final rites. Instead, he looked upward. And he smiled. The execution was swift. There were no last-minute appeals. No dramatic final words. Just the quiet hum of machinery. A single breath. And then silence. Years passed, the name Father Langley was spoken in hushed tones, a cautionary tale whispered among those who had once trusted him. Some still believed he had been a man of God, driven to madness. Others saw him as something else entirely, something that had worn the mask of faith to hide what lurked beneath. The courtroom had spoken, and history would remember. Because no matter how many prayers he had whispered, no matter how many sermons he had preached, Langley had been judged. Not by God, but by men. The case was closed. The trial had ended. The execution had been carried out. And yet, years later, questions still remain. Because for every secret that was uncovered, for every crime that was proven, there were others that slipped through the cracks. Other names, other lives, and other disappearances. The first whisper of something larger came from a detective who had worked the original case. Long after Langley was gone, he began revisiting old records, re-examining missing persons reports from the years before the murder that sealed the priest's fate. And what he found was disturbing. He found 4 names. 2 women and 2 children. All of them had vanished. And all of them had one thing in common. Father Langley. The first was a woman, a Hungarian immigrant, just like the one he had married in secret. She had worked briefly at a different church in another town. One day she simply stopped showing up. No body was ever found. No family came forward. She was forgotten. Until now. The second woman was a teacher. She had attended Langley's sermons, often staying late to speak with him afterward. She was last seen near the church one evening. And then, gone. No signs of a struggle. No familiar enemies. She left behind a packed suitcase in her apartment, as if she had been planning to leave, but never got the chance. The third name was John Smith. A young boy. There is no relatives and no history. Just a child who appeared one day, living in a small boarding house. And the last person seen with him? Was Langley. Witnesses claimed the priest had taken an interest in the boy, providing him with food, shelter, even clothing. One woman recalled seeing them walking together late one evening, the priest's hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. The next morning the child was gone. No records of him ever existed. No birth certificate. No school enrollment. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. The fourth and final case was perhaps the most chilling. A girl. No one knew her name. No one knew how she had gotten there. But one afternoon, years after Langley's execution, construction workers renovating an old church made a discovery beneath the floorboards. A small body. Long buried. No official cause of death could be determined. But the evidence was clear, she had been hidden. And the church where she was found? Langley had once preached there. Some argue that Langley had lost his grip on reality, that he was a man consumed by his own delusions, his mind twisted by faith and obsession. Others disagree. They say there was no madness, no voices from above, just cold, deliberate actions carried out by a man who hid behind the pulpit, who used his position to shield himself from suspicion. A man who was not lost in confusion, but in control of every step. In his final moments he did not cry. He did not plead for mercy. He did not fight. Instead, he met his fate with quiet acceptance. But was it the acceptance of a man who believed he was going to a better place? Or the silence of someone who knew exactly what he had done, and simply no longer cared? To this day, Father Langley remains the only priest ever executed for murder in the United States. His case stands alone in history, a reminder of what hides behind closed doors, of the trust that can be betrayed, of the faith that can be twisted into something different entirely. His story was supposed to end at the execution chamber, but the questions never stopped, the missing never returned, and the truth even now remains just out of reach. The case is closed, but the shadows it left behind? They never fade away. A man who believed he was doing God's work, or he claimed so. In the end, he was sentenced to die for his crimes. But was justice truly served? Or did the real story remain buried with him? Some say he was a man lost in delusion, that his faith consumed him, twisted him, and made him believe he was following divine orders. Others argue there was no confusion at all, that he knew exactly what he was doing, that every action was deliberate, that he didn't hear voices from above, only the ones inside his own mind. His last words were chilling in their simplicity: "I forgive those who have wronged me." But who had wronged him? The courts? The church? Or was he speaking to someone absolutely different? Someone only he could see? Even now, his story is surrounded by unanswered questions. And we want to hear what you think. Was Langley truly insane, or was he fully aware of his crimes? Did justice prevail, or did the system fail to uncover the full truth? And the biggest question of all, were there more victims? That Langley never spoke of it. Let's discuss in the comments. What do you believe? If this story left you questioning everything, then don't forget to like this video, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime cases like this, because the next story? It might be even darker than this one.